My guest today is Maarten Balliauw. Maarten, how are you, sir?
All good here. How about yourself, David?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to have you on my show. I've been trying to get you on, or thinking about getting you on for years, since where our paths keep crossing at various international events every couple of years. But we finally got a chance to talk in London last month,
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
was
And
good.
thank you for the invitation to the podcast here as well. It's uh,
Oh,
it's
excellent.
it's an
Yeah, give
honor
us a
to
chance
be
to talk
on.
even more.
Yeah.
What do you do, Maarten?
I'm head of customer success currently at Duende Software, which is a company that builds identity server, basically a solution that allows you to build your own identity and access management solution using OAuth and OpenID Connect and all of those things. At the same time, also venturing into other products with Duende, such as BFF, which is backend for frontends, that lets you build applications using Angular, Vue, React, or whatever, without managing access tokens that you would use to connect to your APIs
Hmm.
in the server side, and not store all of those in the browser.
Ah, is it safe to say that you are an expert on identity management?
Trying to be, but I don't know if that's an area where anyone can be a true expert.
It
There's
is a
so many
complex
things in
area.
there.
People just getting started at this, I think there's some key concepts that people often misunderstand: authentication and authorization. Can you talk about those? They sound so similar. I think that's why people mix them up sometimes.
They are very similar in sound, but they're also very often used together. So, in its basic form, authentication is saying, are you allowed to, or do you have a username? Do you have a password? Do you have any credential to prove that this is you? Whereas authorization is really saying, okay, this person who we have proof of their identity is allowed to do something like get access to a certain resource, um, go into the door at a discotheque or something like that. So basically, authentication is checking your ID, and authorization is letting you into a building based on the fact that you have this ID and your identity that is
Got it.
there.
Authentication is who you are. Authorization is given who you are. Can you do this thing you want
Yeah,
to do?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I know, I'm a .NET guy. I work for Microsoft, and I've been in the Microsoft world for a long time. Let's talk specifically about ASP.NET and how these concepts are implemented in ASP.NET applications.
Yeah. So in ASP.NET, there's actually a really good framework or a really good integration to work with authentication and authorization both. So in the simplest form, there's this concept of having a claims principle in your application, which, if you're building a web application, for example, you will have the ability to figure out whether you are logged in or not. This is the authentication part. And that will be reflected in the fact that your current HTTP context, your current request has an identity or a claims identity assigned, where you can look at the username, whether they're authenticated, and all of that. Now, the bigger question becomes, how does that claims principle get created, right? So one way to do that is by building your own login form and using the built-in cookie authentication handler in ASP.NET Core, where you can basically say, look, the username and password matches. I'll set a cookie. In that cookie, you store the fact that this user is logged in, what their username is, or what identifier they have, some additional information that you may want. ASP.NET Core encrypts that thing, pushes out on the response, and the next request you make to the server will have that cookie. ASP.NET Core will take care of reading that cookie, seeing what's in there, and providing you with that identity.
Yeah, so that's the authentication, and then once it reads it, then there's some authorization that kicks in as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's some authorization options in ASP.NET Core as well, where you can essentially, the easiest one is to do role-based authorization, where in that identity you would also store their role. For example, you can say they're an administrator, or they are some manager, or whatever role you want to put in there. And if you're building ASP.NET Core MVC or Razor pages or something like that, you can put an attribute there that says, look, whenever someone accesses this page or this resource, I need them to be authorized and they have to be in this specific role. Doing that basically means that ASP.NET Care will take care of the fact that the user is logged in and authenticated, but also look at the role property in that claims identity that is there and see whether they are actually in that role or not. And based on that, give them access or return a status code that says forbidden. Now,
Okay. Yeah.
role-based
Yeah.
authorization is one approach there. There's another approach that you can take, and that is claims-based authorization, where essentially next to the role, which could be a claim, you can store additional properties on the identity. So you can say, for example, that they can read customer data or do something like that. So you can store a lot of things in there. It's a way of doing things, but of course, if you have a very complex system, you will have a lot of claims in that identity. They go into that cookie keeps growing and so on. So that's probably also not what you want to do. There's a third approach there in ASP.NET Core, and that is to use policy-based authorization. Policy-based authorization basically gives you access to, it gives you an ability to add policies to your solution. So basically what you can do is create a policy that says, for example, this person has to be an administrator, but then that policy can have requirements where you say, okay, look, the role has to be administrator. You can have another one where you say this policy says that the user should have read access to customer data. Well, you can have a policy that looks at the role. If they're administrator, then that will probably be true. But it could also contain an if statement where you check whether a database record exists where they have this access or whatever. So you can kind of build your own policies and say, look, these are the properties to look at for this user to make sure that they match this policy. And you can also combine those policies. So you could say that this person has to have a salesperson policy, but also be in a specific group and maybe also have specific requirements in terms of they can access our over 1 million revenue customers or something like that. So you can really do a lot of interesting things with those policies. Use the framework out of the box, but also implement your own authorization policy where you can add your custom logic.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of flexibility in this, but there's also a lot of complexity in these things.
Oh, yes.
I think the industry is trying to manage this complexity with certain standards. Talk a little bit about that.
So there's a lot of standards. So in terms of authorization, there's a lot of things going on there as well. At Duende, we focus more on the authentication part of things, where I mean things flow naturally, but we focus mostly on authentication. The idea there is that we support any type of authentication that ASP.NET Core also supports. And I think that's a healthy approach to take in terms of how you build your solutions, because that also means that you can look at documentation integration that is there for the framework. So one of the things that the industry is currently adding, or has been for a while, is this entire concept of how do you authenticate users when you have this microservices style architecture. Imagine you have a client application that is a browser app or a mobile app or whatever. You want to use one or multiple APIs. How do you prove to the API that you're actually logged into this client application? And one way to do that is by using OpenID Connect, which is a standard that exists to support exactly that scenario. So what OpenID Connect does is it makes sure that as a user of a client, so as a user of the application is the client in this case, as a user, you have to go to a authentication server, which could be identity server, for example, but there's different solutions out there as well. And what will happen is that the client application has to tell this authorization server, like, look, I'm this application, I have this user. Can you please log them in and send me back a valid proof that they can access this application, which is typically an access token or something like that. There's different approaches there as well in the protocol. Generally, when you log in and you give consent that you grant this specific application access to whatever API that you are trying to access, this authorization server will send you back a token, which then the client application can use to access the API. That token is going to contain some information about the user. So at the minimum, it's going to contain an identifier of who is trying to use this API. It's also going to be signed typically by the authorization server so that the API has proof that you've actually passed validation and this entire token has really been issued by that server that sits there in the middle. And then the client can just talk with the API by continuously passing that token to the API.
That's OpenID Connect you just described there, right?
That's OpenID Connect.
How does that differ from OAuth?
So OAuth is basically the same, and OpenID Connect is an extension on top of OAuth. So OAuth has this entire flow described. OpenID adds on top of that, like what should such a token look like? What are valid mechanisms to sign this token that you're passing along? What if you want to have a token that is only valid for 1 hour, but you want to allow the client to refresh that token at some point and get a new token that is valid for 1 hour? Like, how does all of that work? That's part of the OpenID specification.
I see. Okay. Um, and you mentioned that Microsoft has an built into ASP.NET, or ASP.NET Core, I should say, things that will implement this process. But they're not the only provider. They're not the only identity provider. They're not the only person implementing authorization as well. There's other tools out there as well, and other companies working on this.
So the nice thing is that ASP.NET Core comes with the client infrastructure for all of this. So if you want to consume an API that accepts the tokens that you can get using OpenID Connect, for example, all of that is in ASP.NET Core. You can add JOT tokens. So that's the token that you would send over the wire. That's all part of the infrastructure. And by having all of that in the framework, you can use ASP.NET Core with basically any authorization server out there. So ours, Identity Server, is one that you could use. Entra ID, for example, also implements this, so you can store user data there and use that one to manage the APIs and the clients that you want to work with. And there's several others out there as well.
Okay, and Entra, for those that don't know, is a rebranding of what used to be called Azure Active Directory. And when you said ours, you're talking about the company that you work for, which is
Duende Identity Server, yeah.
Duende Identity Server. Okay, tell me a little about that.
So Identity Server is so you're familiar with Azure Active Directory and Entra, I guess.
I am, but maybe my
it's that's a software as a service where you can do all of the user management, manage the applications, etc. Our product, Identity Server, is slightly different there in that we provide all of the protocol extensions to build the server side of this entire authentication and OpenID Connect story, but you will have to build it yourself. So to put it quickly, we are an SDK that allows you to build your own Entra ID. You might wonder,
build your own Entra ID, mean build your own identity provider.
Build your own identity provider similar to Entra ID or any of the other ones. The reason why you might want to do that is, first of all, not everyone needs this hosted solution or whatever. We also see a lot of companies that have their own user store and everything worked out already. Like, how do you integrate that with something that is already out there? Using our SDK, you can actually integrate with those things and build your own, roll your own that uses the existing user store that you might have. You may not want to be using a software as a service product for this. That's another good reason to use Identity Server. But also you may want to customize things. So the fact that it's an SDK also means that in every step of the OIDC flow, OpenID Connect flow, you can basically plug in and roll your own logic, whether that's UI logic, whether that's logic on how you authenticate, for example. You can do many things. On top of that, there's a lot of configuration settings that you can add where based on what industry you are in, you can enable or disable specific aspects of the OpenID Connect specification. So one of the specs that is there, for example, is the financial grade API, where you will need things like proof of possession, where you can prove that the token, or where you can prove as an application that you are the application that is accessing the server and not someone who just sold the access token that you have. So that is part of the financial grade API specification there. And with Identity Server, it's easier to get those configured and set up for your solution if you're in that industry.
Okay. And we were talking before we started recording about some of the specific issues with single page applications and trying to store a lot of security information in a cookie, which is a good solution, but it may or may not be 100% secure, and how you can address that. Can you speak up to
Yeah,
that?
so that's another one. So based on the type of application you are building, this entire OpenID Connect flow and so on is easy to implement and kind of secure by default. But if you're building like a browser application or you're building a mobile application, but typically a browser application, it's very easy if that is an Angular application or React or Vue or something like that. You will need to store a couple of secrets in the browser that you do not control as the application author. It is the user's browser, so it's also easy to fish out that sensitive information that allows you to access the API. So typically, if you would have such a single page application, you log in, you do this entire authorization flow and authentication flow with the server, you get back a token. What will typically happen is that that token has to be stored in local storage, for example, in the browser. Anyone who has a little bit of background in IT will be able to fish out that token from local storage in the browser. And at that point, they can just access the API that you may have with that token.
And pretend to be you.
Yeah, that might not be an issue, but that might be an issue if you want to really only support your specific application, or there's regulations in place where you really have to make sure that it's this application. Uh, One solution to that could be to use, for example, this proof of possession, where you have a signature where you can actually prove, okay, this is my application accessing my API and so on. The problem with that is if it's a browser application, you would also have to store that signature or that the certificate to create that signature in the browser. So that's not really a solution. The only solution to not have that token available for anyone to use is to not store it in a browser. And that's where one of the newer specifications or newer guidelines actually comes into place. And that's the backend for frontend guideline slash pattern. The idea with that one is that your application, your single page application, is going to be hosted on a server somewhere, but that server is going to take care of all of the token management and token exchange with the authorization server and pass it on to the API, do the refreshes and all of that. Um,
Oh. So that token, rather than being stored in the browser, it's stored somewhere
yeah,
out
it's stored
online
somewhere
in a
out
secure
there.
store in the internet.
Yeah, exactly. And on the server, basically proxying the calls to the API that you're consuming from the application.
Hmm.
And your application is basically only going to use cookie authentication to authenticate with that server that you're hosting this from. So you still know, okay, it's this user and this token is for that specific user and so on. But nobody is able to fish out that token from the browser. So it's, first of all, more
Interesting.
secure. But
Hmm.
second of all, it also allows for a much easier programming model on the client. So if you're building a React application, you no longer have to implement this entire flow of going to identity server, for example, making sure that you get consent, getting back the token, sending that token on every single request that you make to the API, making sure that you refresh those tokens, etc.
Hmm.
All of that is handled by this backend for front-end proxy that you put in the middle. And on the client side, basically what you do is if you want to log in, you redirect to a login endpoint where the server triggers that entire flow. If you want to log out, you clear the cookie. And on every request you want to make to the API, the Angular application, for example, is just going to request from that server where you're hosting the application. The server is going to do the entire token thing, refreshing thing, and so on. And you're just making requests where you don't even really have to care about the fact that this is using tokens under the hood.
Hmm. The world is changing.
It very much is, yes.
Can you tell us about what's happening in the world of identity management? What kind of changes are happening?
There's a lot of things happening continuously. So the entire landscape is basically changing all the time. This financial grade API is a good example there, with the fact that you want to prove that you're the application that is consuming everything that is there. There's a couple of other things that this financial API standard is bringing along with it. And one of those is grant management for OAuth and OpenID Connect.
Did you say
So
grants management?
grants, yeah. So
Okay.
basically, whenever you connect or whenever you first authenticate to an to something like Identity Server, for example, you typically have to say, look, I consent to the fact that I share my profile information with this API that I want to consume. I consent that whatever claims you're adding, you have to consent to that. Once you do that, you have a grant where you say, okay, look, the user has granted you access to all of those claims and granted you access to that information. Problem is, what if those grants, what if you want to change those along the roads? Typically, you would have to re-authenticate maybe and clear the existing token, do an entire token refresh and so on. One of the new specs that are coming or it's being worked on is to make it more dynamic where you can add or remove those grants along the way without having to basically throw away all of the tokens that you currently have for this specific user. A good example there would be if you model like a banking API where you have access to different bank accounts. Maybe you want to grant access for this client application to only consume information from one bank account that you might have, but maybe next year you want to add a grant where you say, okay, I have 2 accounts now at that second account. So this API is one, or this spec is one that allows for that scenario. So that is one. In terms of identity and security and so on, one that I'm personally a big fan of and really interested to see play out is the adoption of passkeys in various operating systems and browsers and so on. So we opened this one with authentication and the fact that you can log in, you have username, password stores, etc. The idea with passkeys is that you would no longer have passwords and secrets stored on the server, so no more database that has passwords. And by extension, you can even go one step further where you no longer have usernames either. So the idea with passkeys is that instead of sending a password to the server that the server then has to hash and store and everything, the idea with passkeys is that you have a trusted device. Your browser could be a browser plugin, which could be a password manager, could be your operating system, where you essentially say, look, I trust this device is mine. My device on the first time that I register with a website is going to set up a public and private key. It's going to send the public key for a specific website to that website and say, look, I'm this public key. Next time I present myself, please ask me to sign anything with the private key that I have here, and you can use this public key to validate that that signature is valid or not. If there's a data breach, that's good. There's public keys being leaked, but nobody can do anything with those, at least until quantum computers become a big thing. So there's no risk in data breaches and so on. Second of all, the user doesn't have to share any repeatable secret with a server as well. So very often people use the same passwords over and over again. I really hope that everyone listening to this podcast is actually using password managers and so on, at least. But the idea with passkeys is that every single site or any resource that you want to access has a different passkey with its own public and private key, so that even if one key gets compromised, it's only for that thing and only on that specific device. And it also becomes very easy for the server to say, I want to revoke access from this device because it's just removing the knowledge of that public key that exists.
I was at one point in my life guilty of using the same or similar passwords on every site, and I did pay the price a couple times. Not catastrophically, but
Yeah,
people
I think we all
sometimes got.
kind of are. Yeah,
I wised up a few years ago, and I am using a
yeah,
password manager. But again, there's a lot of things like internally in Microsoft. There's nothing that I use a password for. I don't even know if that password even exists. One that I set
yeah,
like 4 years ago. But everything is done through
yeah.
multi-factor authentication or through some sort of identity principle is passed. Boy, this is a lot of information you've given us today. Can you provide any links that people want to explore further?
Yeah,
Like, what if they're
absolutely.
just getting started?
Yeah.
What's a good place to go?
If they're just getting started, I would say the documentation that Microsoft has on ASP.Core Authentication.
Okay.
I will say it's a lot of information you will get in a very brief period of time. It might be overwhelming, but it's a good start. It shows all of the options that are available. One thing that I do miss there a little bit is the more opinionated, like use this in this case, etc.
Sure.
But I think once you get the basics there, you can also find that information out there. If
Do you
you're
have
up
an
for some if you're up for some bedside reading, I would say it is actually interesting to read the OAuth and OpenID specification.
Mhm.
It's a lot of text. It's all, I think you can download a little bit nicer PDF, but it's all ASCII and very, very bare bones if you read through it. But it also gives you a good understanding of why certain design choices were made, why certain things are the way they are. And it will help you actually understand more of the practical implementations that you find in ASP.core, for example. And I think reading the spec will actually give you a better understanding of what to use when and in what case.
Okay. Do you have an online presence?
I do. I'm on Blue Sky. Just find my name on there with a .be behind it. I have a blog. I'm guilty of not blogging too much in the past years. And as anyone having a blog, I promise I will make up for it at some point, but that's not going to be anytime soon.
Okay. Well, Maarten, this was a lot of information. I've learned a lot today. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me. Looking at the last 15 years of my career, I can say that thanks to technology and its way of making it easier to connect with people, I made a good number of friends.